For more on how the attack has impacted Australian society, we can speak now to David Camroux, a senior researcher and adjunct professor in Asia Studies at Sciences Po here in Paris. Good morning, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
My pleasure.
First, just what's your sense of the mood in Australia nearly a week now after this attack?
I think it is a fairly somber mood. These kind of events in Australia, like elsewhere, brings out the best and the worst. The best we saw, this morning in Australia with those surf lifesavers commemorating on the beach. Yesterday there was what we call a paddle out, where surfers and swimmers go out and form a circle. It's something you do when a surfer is killed as a sign of commemoration. So, and we've seen lines of people waiting 4 to 7 hours to give their blood in blood banks. So we've seen also, I think, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, after initially not quite knowing how to respond, I think found the right kind of narrative. There was an interfaith church service at St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney. Then he went to the main synagogue in the centre of Sydney. So there has been that sort of expression of solidarity and condolence. The Prime Minister also rejected the demands of the Conservative opposition, the Liberal National Coalition, for an immediate recall of Parliament, which is probably just as well, because that would have been a raucous meeting, just spreading divisions. I mean, the division, there used to be a bipartisan view about Israel and about the Palestinian cause. When Australia joined France, Canada, and the United Kingdom in recognizing a Palestinian state in August and then announced at the United Nations in September, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu accused Albanese of putting oil on the fire, feeding the fire of anti-Semitism in Australia. And I think the worrying thing that's occurring is this amalgamation between not being supportive of Israel and anti-Semitism. So this is why what the government has done, they're going to introduce stricter laws. There was a report in July on anti-Semitism. They're going to apply most of the measures in that report, those that can be applied without too much affecting the principle of freedom of speech. These buyback campaigns for weapons, restricting the number of weapons. And certainly that needed to be done. There were loopholes in that legislation, which goes back to the massacre of 1996. So I think, there has been this sort of positive side of reacting to what happened. Obviously, there are always politicians, for example, a senator called Pauline Hanson, who heads an extreme right party called One Nation. She held up a pistol and say, as they say in the US, the guns don't kill people, people kill people. And she said the day after the massacre, went to Bondi Beach and made some inflammatory comments. That was very much disapproved of by the Australian population. So I think trying to take political advantage of it is going to be counterproductive to those who wish to do so. But on the other hand, this question of how we, in a multicultural society, remember today that about 1% of the population would declare themselves as Jewish, more than 3% would claim to be Muslim. Australia has changed. And the images we see daily of what is occurring in Gaza, has fed into this kind of general sentiment of, Australia is no longer the great supporter of Israel that it was at the time of the creation of Israel, which was pushed by an Australian who was president of the Security Council of the United Nations, Dr. Herb Everett, in 1947. That Australia no longer exists. You have in federal parliament voices defending the Palestinian cause. Those who are most pro-Israeli in the parliament actually lost their seats in recent elections to independents of a more liberal sort of ecological bent. So, the political complexion of Australia has changed, the society has changed, and that has to be dealt with.
Yeah, as you're describing, Australia, like many countries, is facing this kind of complicated, having to navigate this complicated relationship really between the rise in anti-Semitism, but also what's been happening in Gaza and sort of the country's own support for a Palestinian state. Do you feel like Australia has done a good job sort of navigating those tensions, or is it something that we've seen a lot surrounding this attack?
I think it's done reasonably well. I mean, there have been massive pro-Palestinian demonstrations, including Jewish groups actually involved in those demonstrations who are anti-Zionist and for a Palestinian state. But they were on the fringes, to be fair. There were extreme, there were a few Islamic State flags being flown. There are preachers preaching, imams preaching hatred. So it's finding this delicate balance between, the right to people to live their faith and express their faith, and when it becomes divisive and it spreads hatred. And I don't think any country's found, the right solution. The Australians have not done too badly so far. The killers, the assassins, the terrorists of last Saturday, were lone wolves, as the specialists would say. This is unique, a father and son team, and that's going to have to be investigated. Who radicalized whom, the father or the son, or the other way around? And so they're things that are very difficult for police forces, for intelligence agencies, to be able to follow up.
There's also the gun control aspect of this attack. Australia has already announced a new gun buyback program, the largest since the landmark program they had launched in the wake of the 1996 mass shooting in Port Arthur. But the Prime Minister said that there are currently 4 million firearms in Australia, so even more than at the time of the Port Arthur massacre, meaning there was a huge buyback program, but then the number of guns sort of surged again. So how did that happen, and could this new buyback program really be effective?
I think it'll be partially effective. Why did that happen? Because the reforms after 1996 were not fully implemented. There was the need for a national register of weapons, and that doesn't exist. Australia is a federal system like the United States, and each state that has its own regulations, its own register, and that's something that has to be dealt with, and I think it will be dealt with. But also, I think there was a sense of complacency after that effective buyback in 1996, 1997, that Australia has dealt with the problem. But incrementally, the number of weapons has increased. Do keeping in mind, however, it's nowhere near the proportion in the United States, where I think there are, 2 guns for every American. And that's also was a shock for the Australians. Australia, they look at what happens almost weekly in the United States, or daily, some kind of, mass shooting, or at least shooting of more than 3 people. And they say, this is not us. But this was a wake-up call that when you've got some crazy people out there who have access to weaponry, there are things that have to be done.
All right, David Camroux, thank you so much again for your analysis this morning. That was David Camroux, a senior researcher and adjunct professor in Asia Studies at Sciences Po here in Paris.